April 1945, a low ridge outside a shattered village in central Germany. Morning fog hangs like a curtain, the smell of cordite and wet earth. A single Panzer-V turret turned, slightly left gunner squinting through a smashed periscope rumbles into view, glacis gleaming under a flat sun. The crew trusts that glacis 80 mm of well-sloped armor set at roughly 55 degrees a plate that wrote the Panther into legend. Wikipedia. A Sherman with a 76 mm now peels off a hedgerow, takes a hurried ranging shot, a solid hit rings against the slope but does not pass through. The shell does not need to punch cleanly to matter. Repeated impacts, splintering interior shocks, and a jammed turret ring can turn invulnerability into immobility. Contemporary ballistic tables show the 76 mm APC-BC could still deliver roughly 9100 mm equivalent penetration at combat ranges, enough to threaten mantlet zones and weaker lower glacis angles under real angles of impact. Wikipedia. While the Panther momentarily reels a forward observer on a ridge, calls it in battery fire for effect. In well-drilled Allied batteries, the call-compute fire cycle was compact. A pre-registered mission or rapid FDC solution could produce lethal splashes inside a minute or two, converting a localized tank duel into a combined arms trap. Artillery didn't need pinpoint armor penetration. Blast, shrapnel, and shock could blind sights, break tracks, and force crews to abandon otherwise invulnerable tanks. U.S. Marine Corps. The myth of the Panther's frontal invincibility exists on firing tables and blueprints. In the mud and mosaic of real terrain doctrine, effective 75. 76 mm gunnery plus fast on-call artillery repeatedly turned that myth into an operational weakness. March 1945. The map is a grid of pressure points. Allied armoured columns press on the Ruhr and across the Rhineland. Supply dumps hum with repair parts. Field hospitals strain at the seams. On paper, Germany is running out of fuel and trained crews, but on the ground, the Panther still reads as a command: hold the street, deny the road, blunt and advance. That reputation matters, not because the Panther is invulnerable, but because belief in invulnerability changes behavior. It makes commanders hedge infantry, give ground supply officers, reroute convoys to avoid predictable choke points. The question in that narrow window is not whether the Panther can be killed. It is whether Allied forces can systematically erase the tactical advantage the Panther projects fast enough to flip a front line. The immediate operational problem is simple and urgent. American units need to collapse pockets and keep momentum. Time is a resource as critical as fuel. Every day a local German strongpoint holds. Every night a convoy is endangered, is another day for German industry to salvage materiel, for units to reform, for political bargaining to gain traction. If Panthers and other heavy systems remain effective as local deterrents, the campaign stretches into attrition and negotiation. If those systems are rendered tactically impotent, the collapse accelerates defensive positions, stop being shields, and become targets. Psychology and doctrine meet logistics here. German crews, even when short on spares or fuel, still fight with the certainty that their machines will buy time. That certainty affects choices. Fight in streets rather than withdraw. Accept risk to protect a roadblock. Conserve a Panther by refusing small engagements. American commanders see a different ledger. The United States can sustain losses on a scale Germany cannot. Factories in the rear replace hulls, pilots rotate in repair trains, move tanks back to refit. That industrial margin allows American commanders to trade units for tactical knowledge, to accept initial setbacks, in order to learn how a Panther actually dies in close country. Tactical adaptations are only one column of the stake. Combined arms sequencing the disciplined insistence on the first accurate shot, immediate conceal and relocate discipline, and rapid call for fire converts local technical parity into an operational advantage. If a forward observer can fix a target and an artillery battery can bracket it within minutes, a single heavy tank becomes a locus for annihilation rather than a rallying point. If fighter cover and longer-range tank guns deny the Panther the space it needs to leverage slope and distance, its frontal armor is less a fortress and more a liability. There is also a strategic arithmetic beneath the battlefield tempo. Faster, predictable tempo favors the side that can sustain the flow of men and material. The Allies in early 1945 have increasingly secure lines of supply and a production base capable of replacing losses. German logistics are frayed and brittle. That imbalance means the value of taking risks, throwing a fresh tank into a risky urban ambush because another will arrive from the depot, is asymmetrical. It is a luxury Germany cannot reciprocate. Finally, the political dimension sits quietly under the tactical. High command on both sides understands that battlefield narratives ripple beyond the front line. Film and dispatches showing a burning Panther or a failed U-boat undercut morale and bargaining power. Conversely, images of intact heavy armor sustain a narrative of deterrence that can be wielded in negotiations. Neutralizing the Panther's myth is therefore both a military act and a psychological one. It removes an argument from the enemy's hand. In short, the stakes in that corridor are not merely a contested street or one lost tank. They are tempo replacement calculus and the removal of a tactical myth that gives the enemy bargaining space. The next volley of decisions will determine whether the front converts to collapse or buys the enemy time. The Panther is a lethal geometry, first seen as an argument in steel. From a distance, its long, high-velocity gun and sloped glacis let it pick fights on its own terms. It controls range, dictates who shoots first, and converts small mistakes into catastrophic outcomes. In open country, that combination is devastating. In tight, broken terrain, it becomes a set of vulnerabilities, because the physics that make the Panther formidable at 800 meters also create seams and angles that become deadly when the engagement distance collapses. A tank fight is not armor numbers on paper, it is the sequence of human and mechanical actions that happen in 5 or 10 seconds. The Panther's optics and powered gun traverse reward stability, a steady sight picture, a predictable recoil cycle, a trained loader. When rubble and corners interrupt that stability, what wins is the first clear, steady sight. At 200 to 300 meters, the geometry of streets and shattered farmsteads, the advantage flips. A crew that obtains and holds a clean aim before the other side can lay its gun will decide the encounter in a heartbeat. That is where the American gunnery and ammunition mix become decisive. A 76 class round delivered under discipline and timed to capitalize on the first clean sight can do the work a thicker plate might prevent at range. Hitting a lower glacis seam, the junction of plates, the shot trap at the mantlet or the turret ring produces effects that are not measured in millimeters alone. Hydraulic systems vaporize, turret bearings, seize periscopes, shatter, and the M-SO2. Human rhythm inside the tank breaks. A tank that cannot traverse or cannot close its hatches stops being a weapon. It becomes a burning hull that invites indirect fires and engineers with demolition tools. Mechanics matter as much as metal. In confined angles, the Panther's traverse and the gunner's cycle are interrupted by obstacles. Debris causes suspension to bind, blast marks, disrupt sight alignment, and the loader's motion is slowed by heat and smoke. Those small delays accumulate. American armored doctrine at that stage emphasizes the first accurate shot, make a clean hit, then relocate, then call for fire if needed. That rhythm converts a marginal ballistic match into a tactical edge. You do not trade rounds until you have to. You take the clean chance and then deny the enemy time to respond. Artillery and observers complete the chain. Immobilize the target and a battery does the rest. Bracketing does not need surgical accuracy to finish a tank. Concussion and fragmentation ignite secondary fires, collapse tracks, and make any recovery or counteraction dangerous. In urban or bocage country, a disabled heavy tank is the exact thing indirect fire was designed to exploit. The combined sequence acquire shoot move call turns the supposed strength of frontal armor into a magnet for destruction. Ammunition choice and delivery profile are practical sciences of survival. Different rounds behave differently on impact. Some punch through and wreck internal systems, others detonate to create spalling and shock that incapacitate crews. It is not exotic chemistry that matters here, but match the right projectile at the right angle at the right distance fired by a gunner who held a clear sight first. Under those conditions, a single, well-placed round can end the fight before the Panther's attributes matter. Repeatability is the operative word. One dramatic kill reads as luck. A pattern of similar outcomes reads as doctrine. Field reports of the period show the same chain repeating: a frontal hit that disables an observer calling in fire, a battery bracketing, and the target rendered unsalvageable within the hour. That is not theatre. It is a process. The engineering flaws that matter: seams, shot traps, vulnerable lower plates, seized traverses, ruptured hydraulics, are mundane. The human failures that matter: a shattered sight picture, a stalled loader, a commander who cannot reorient the crew's routine, are even more ordinary. When an opponent learns to structure engagements around those ordinary failings, the extraordinary reputation of a weapon system collapses into predictable outcomes. In the end, the kill chain reduces to a set of simple, brutal facts: control the sight picture, apply a projectile that exploits seams and systems, deny recovery with indirect fire. Under those constraints, the Panther's frontal armor stops being an argument and becomes a liability, heavy, conspicuous, and when disabled, lethal to its crew. That is how 76 class ammunition, disciplined gunnery, and rapid supporting fires repeatedly unmade the myth of frontal invulnerability in real terrain. They breathe the same air the Germans do, but from different machines and with different doctrine. Inside the Panther, the world is a hollow of steel and warm breath. Instruments glow faintly. The periscope glass is a small, clear rectangle that is suddenly too small for the street. The commander's voice is low and economical. Range 250. Prepare AP. The loader's hands move on muscle memory: strip ram, slap the breech. Outside, the street narrows to a single kill lane. The gunner counts sight marks. The turret ring gives a small protesting creak as it searches for a sweep. The powered traverse answers with a practiced whine that has settled into the crew's calm. Then the shot arrives from nowhere, close enough to be polite. The hull jolts. For a heartbeat, everything is noise metal, the dull clank of suspended equipment, the smell of warmed lacquer and hot oil. Hydraulic fluid hisses like a small animal. The commander reaches for the intercom and finds static where words should be. The gunner checks the reticle and feels it tremble. The sight picture breaks the way a record skips. Someone in the crew swears under breath, not because there is time for feeling, but because the rhythm of the task has been interrupted. Instruments that gave certainty now offer only broken readings. Inside the American hull, there is no romance, only procedure. The crew checks the flanks, holds the hull low, and waits for a clean sight. Target Panther 250 fire when ready, the commander says, with the economy of a machine that has practiced lines until they are part of its bone. The gunner breathes at the moment of firing to steady the sight. He sees the glacis seam come up in the crosshair and presses the trigger. Recoil punches the tank. The loader swings a live round into place for a follow-up if needed. There is no cheer, only the quiet click of metal and the methodical call: target hit. Observer request fire. The sequence is surgical: acquire, fire, relocate, call. Men act as parts in a clock until the clock is not answering. The German crew's hands are not idle. They check hatches, they probe linkages, they listen for the subtle metallic betrayals that mean bearings have seized or seals have ruptured. Each failed system produces a catalogue of sound: a grinding under torque, a wet sucking noise, where pumps fail, a thin metallic ping as a tracking pin snaps. The commander tries to reorient the turret. The traverse jams. He slaps the periscope glass with a gesture that is more habit than hope. The radio, once a warm thread of contact, offers only the brittle scrape of a dying reception. Inside the hull, the air tastes of overheated rubber and something like burnt varnish. Men breathe faster into respirators because fear is chemical first, thought second. Across the street, the forward observer keys his set voice, quick and precise. Grid 412 by 8 to 2. Battery ready, fire for effect. The battery answers in clipped, rehearsed syllables. The observer times impacts against landmarks. Impact sounds are not cinematic. They are a staccato of concussion, a shifting of masonry, and a new pattern of dust and secondary fires. The Panther, already disabled, becomes a geometry to be reshaped, a concussion here, a fragmentation there. Engineers will later call it an unsalvageable hull. At the moment, it is a locus that draws ordnance like a magnet draws filings. The American crew's language is spare. Short radio bursts, procedural checks, ammo ready, loader cold, move right 2 degrees after fire. The driver watches mirrors and listens to the track rhythm because movement even after a hit is survival. If the first round did not remove the threat, the doctrine is clear. Relocate, present a different angle, demand the first clear sight again. They do not hunt glory. They do not linger. The men understand loss is replaceable in materiel and in numbers. Their work is to convert that systemic advantage into a reproducible tactical sequence. Inside the Panther, the human mechanics fail faster than the myths. A loader who cannot pass a reload because smoke and heat fog his vision. A gunner whose sight is unset by a smashed optical bracket. A commander who cannot align crew members because the intercom spits static. These are small, ordinary collapses that together render a fighting system inert. There is no single dramatic betrayal. There is a cascade of minor failures. The crew's trained routine angle range fire has been interrupted by physical facts, seam penetration, seized, turret-ruptured hydraulics. Those facts are indifferent to doctrine or reputation. The American crew treats the aftermath as data. They check the target, call it in, mark the grid. Target dead. Hold position 40 seconds for splash, the observer notes. They run the checklist, count rounds, inspect, track, check for leaks. In their voices there is an industrial calm work to be done, casualties to record, engines to keep warm. If infantry must clear the wreck, they will coordinate time and angle. If artillery must come again, they will feed the grid and the flight. Everything is a sequence. Men on both sides register the human cost in the same way. A silence where voices used to be a small object rolling away on a street that had been full of motion. The sudden absence of a routine that meant survival. There is no moralizing, only the practical recognition that systems fail and that human beings inside machines are subject to the same ordinary errors and injuries that make recovery impossible. For the Germans, the Panther becomes an expensive loss and a lesson. For the Americans, it becomes proof that procedure, combined arms, and disciplined gunnery convert technical parity into tactical success. At the end of a day, when the work notes are filed and cameras have taken their frames, the crews return to basic tasks: patch clean, count, wait for orders. Their accounts will be terse, their language procedural. The sensation that lingers is not triumph or shame, but the clang of metal and the smell of hot oil, a ledger of survival written in small mechanical acts. Decision chains that look tactical are often industrial at heart. Frontline shifts in how Panthers were fought did not arise from a single miracle shot. They were the product of a deliberate sequence of command choices, production capacity, and logistics architecture that together changed what commanders were willing to risk. When a unit in the field demonstrated a repeatable kill sequence, acquire fire, relocate, call the moment did not remain local. After-action notes crossed unit boundaries. Photographs and film moved up the chain. Ordnance officers and armoured branch planners translated practical tactics into higher-level orders. That translation is what turns improvised survival into doctrine. Two kinds of authorities made those translations: tactical commanders, who accepted short-term risk for long-term gain, and technical authorities who judged which systems to prioritize for production and deployment. The former were company and battalion commanders who sent reports up recommending standard procedures. The latter sat in the Ordnance Department and in Armoured Branch headquarters and weighed whether a given field fix merited institutional backing. The decision to press a fresh tank design or to formalize a sequence of combined arms drills is therefore as much bureaucratic as it is battlefield. Someone signs the memo that permits a hot sample to be sent to the line, and someone in the repair trains commits manpower to sustain it. Production logic underpinned those signatures. American industry in 1944-45 could absorb the attrition of a high-intensity armoured campaign in ways Germany could not. Hulls could be replaced. Spare parts could be staged at depots. Overhaul shops could strip and rebuild transmissions on schedule. That calculus altered command risk preferences. A company commander could order a Pershing into street fighting, knowing that a replacement, if lost, could be provided by depots and assembly lines farther back. The inverse was true for Germany. Each Panther represented not just a platform, but months of scarce skilled labor and a pool of experienced crewmen. The asymmetry in replacement capacity turned tactical risk into strategic advantage for the side with deeper reserves. Logistics was not only a matter of numbers, it was procedure. Repair trains, recovery units, and forward maintenance depots shortened the time between a vehicle's breakdown and its return to fighting condition. Engineers staged bridging and wrecker assets near likely choke points. Ordnance detachments prepositioned spares for common failure modes, turret bearings, hydraulic seals, sighting brackets. Those anticipatory moves converted a destroyed crew into a recoverable asset in theory and a disposable loss in practice. Where a disabled Panther required weeks to refurbish an American damaged tank could be towed to a forward depot, triaged and returned on a measured schedule. The difference is a tempo, the speed at which lost capacity can be regained, and tempo decides campaigns. Doctrine formalized the tactical sequences that proved effective. Once an engagement pattern repeated, staff officers issued memoranda, updated field manuals and trained replacements on the new SOPs, insist on the first accurate shot, present the clearest possible sight picture, execute immediate relocation after firing, provide rapid artillery brackets when a target is fixed. The language of those orders is procedural because procedure scales. A single heroism can win a fight. An SOP changes how every crew in a division fights. Institutionalizing such procedures reduces reliance on individual skill and increases predictability, exactly the conversion necessary to exploit production advantages. Decision-making at higher levels also accepted temporary imperfection in equipment in order to field capability sooner. New systems were sometimes deployed before exhaustive trials because the operational need outpaced peacetime caution. Commanders and ordnance officers balanced the risk of unproven systems against the strategic benefit of breaking an enemy myth. That willingness to accept imperfect platforms, relying instead on the industrial pipeline to iterate and fix faults, gave American forces the flexibility to change battlefield dynamics rapidly. It is a different model than conserving a limited elite resource. It privileges iterative deployment and correction over preservation. Intelligence and feedback loops closed the gap between observation and policy. Reconnaissance photographs, prisoner interrogations, and captured documents allowed staff to measure whether a frontal hit produced systemic failure or merely a temporary suppression. Local commanders' reports on which seams or angles proved vulnerable were codified into firing tables and training drills. Photographic proof circulating among units created a social proof that changed morale. Seeing a burned Panther on film undermined the aura of invincibility much faster than a single eyewitness account. Finally, the human cost factored into choice. American leaders calculated losses in materiel and personnel against strategic objectives. The industrial margin permitted risk-taking that to a German commander would have seemed reckless. The German calculus was the reverse: conserve scarce, heavy platforms and veteran crews because replacement was unlikely. That difference in value assignment reshaped behavior. Where one side could treat tanks as replaceable elements in a system, the other had to treat them as treasures to be expended with care. The confluence of these elements, command willingness to accept tactical risk ordnance decisions, to field and sustain industrial throughput, to replace and repair, and rapid doctrinal institutionalization produced a new operational reality. Tactical techniques that exploited seams and systems were no longer ad hoc. They became the default mode of engagement. What had been an exceptional kill became a replicable process because the logistics and decision-making apparatus supported and amplified it. Once procedure and production conspire, a myth that depended on rarity and psychological weight loses its teeth. The machine of war shifts from myth to method. The next morning, the film reels, and the terse staff notes do the work that a single firefight could not. They turn an anecdote into an operational problem. A burned hull on movie stock is visible to a brigade commander as a data point. A set of grids and an observer's log turn that image into a reproducible sequence. At the tactical edge, the conversation is immediate and physical. Crews who once trusted the Panther's frontal geometry now hesitate to accept a duel where the enemy can get the first steady sight. Commanders who wrote orders for holding a street at all costs begin to add caveats, deny angled approaches, avoid fixed positions in predictable lanes, demand reconnaissance before committing heavy armor to close country. Tactics change first because human beings change fastest, where the cost is immediate. A Panther commander who loses a mate to a single 76mm hit knows the arithmetic of survival in a way a table of armor thickness cannot convey. He orders hull-down positions, tighter coordination with infantry, and an emphasis on concealment over deliberate show of force. He refuses the old script, no more standing in choke points to buy time. The crews withdraw into camouflage and motion. The vehicle that once functioned as a forward intimidator becomes in practice a rear-anchored asset. Small unit orders begin to read like risk management: preserve the platform, avoid exposures that invite a clear sight, do not become an island. The second layer of collapse is administrative and colder. Staff officers gather after-action reports and photographs and translate them into directives. Ordnance branches circulate lists of recurring failures, turret rings that lock under particular shock profiles, hydraulic lines that vaporize when hit at certain junctions, sighting brackets that fail when the mantlet cracks. Where once doctrine had celebrated the capacity of a single platform to hold ground, the new language emphasizes procedure, deny the enemy a steady sight, insist on rapid relocation after firing coordinate immediate call for fire, once a target is fixed. Those phrases shift behavior because they are easy to train and enforce. Procedure scales in a way heroism does not. The practical upshot is visible across multiple scales. On the street, Panthers are less willing to show their noses. They keep to hull-down positions where possible, rely on infantry screens, and accept the loss of local initiative for the sake of survivability. On the brigade level, commanders stagger deployments to avoid massing valuable vehicles in a single, predictable arc. At the corps level, planners adjust supply and maintenance schedules to account for a higher incidence of catastrophic hits that make recovery impractical. They accept that some vehicles can no longer be returned to service quickly enough to justify risk-taking. The loss calculus shifts what was once a tactical ace becomes a strategic liability. Publicly, the change is less theatrical than one might expect. There are no trumpet calls, no proclamations. Instead, there are quiet procedural memos and updated tabletop drills. A battalion training circular will contain a single functional line that reorients behavior. Engage briefly, relocate, call for indirect fires on fixed heavy armor. That sentence is prosaic, but its effect is enormous. Where once crews learned to exploit the Panther's range and slope, they are now drilled to destroy the conditions under which those qualities matter. Training emphasizes the first accurate shot and the immediate denial of recovery, not the romantic idea of standing and exchanging metal for metal. Morale and psychology follow the tactical and administrative shifts. The aura that once surrounded the Panther depends on rarity and the belief that the machine confers an unassailable advantage. When film shows a Panther burning in a street and staff reports corroborate it as a repeatable pattern, that aura erodes. Infantry who once fell back at the sight of a Panther begin to hold their ground if they know a battery can bracket the vehicle in minutes. Tank crews, seeing practical evidence that disability invites artillery rather than rescue, alter their risk calculus. The effect is cumulative. The more often the sequence repeats, the less terrifying the machine becomes. Perception shifts from monster to asset that can be neutralized. Enemy staff acknowledge the shift in language long before they change their strategy wholesale. Internal notes and prisoner interrogations records that commanders read with the coldness of professional interest begin to include variations on a single point. We can no longer accept the same exposures. We must conserve platforms. That admission is itself profound because it admits scarcity. Losing a Panther is not merely losing a vehicle. It is losing a months-long investment in skilled crew and production scarce to replace. Once doctrine is forced into conservatism, it loses offensive power. Tactics slide from hunting to hiding. That slide has immediate operational consequences. Defensive lines that once relied on the deterrent value of heavy armor must be restructured. Ambushes are recalibrated around discontinuous fields of fire. Supply routes are rerouted to avoid predictable choke points. The side that can accept attrition in materiel, but not in tempo, converts these adjustments into momentum. The other side, constrained by limited replacements and the need to conserve expensive platforms, cedes tempo. The battlefield becomes less about single engineering marvels and more about networks, observers, batteries, recovery vehicles, depot capacity working in concert. In the final accounting, the myth dies not because a machine failed spectacularly once, but because procedure and production conspire to make the failure ordinary. When the same kill chain sight shot, immobilize bracket, repeats enough times to appear on training slides and in staff exams, the enemy's boast that one Panther can lock a street becomes a historical note rather than a tactical reality. The moment of inflection is quiet. A memo signed a training circular, printed a commander who refuses to stake a lane on a single hull. But its effect is decisive. A myth survives on stories. It collapses under method. After that, the Panther is no longer a living argument on the field, but an expensive breakable element in a supply ledger and supply notes win wars. When the reels reached brigade headquarters and the terse dispatches hit corps staff, the incident ceased to be an isolated drama and became a datum. Photographs of a burning hull circulated in briefing rooms. Logistics officers annotated spare part lists with the new priorities. Training cadres folded the sequence into live drills. The immediate effect was administrative: updated firing tables, revised recovery protocols, and a single procedural sentence stamped into manuals: acquire, hit, relocate, call. It is a small thing on paper and a very large thing in practice. Operationally, the consequences spread along three axes. First, tactical posture shifted. Units that once used Panthers as forward intimidators began to conserve them hull down, where possible, screened by infantry, committed only where combined arms backed the risk. The tactical instinct to hold a street because a Panther can gave way to a cautious calculus: preserve the platform, deny the enemy a clear sight, avoid predictable choke points. Second, training adapted crews rehearsed the discipline of the first precise shot and immediate displacement. Observers practiced rapid grid calls, batteries practiced bracketing on short notice. Third, maintenance and supply planning changed ordnance planners, reordered inventories to favor common failure items, turret bearings, hydraulic seals, sight brackets, because replacing a lost Panther was months of scarce labor, while replacing a Sherman with depot repair was a matter of throughput. The psychological effect was no less real. Fear is a social fact, contagious, reinforced by images and stories. When footage showed a Panther immobile in a street and an armored column followed the scripted kill chain, the aura of invincibility thinned. Infantry who had once yielded at the sight of that profile began to hold their ground, knowing that an observer and a battery could make a hulking target disappear. Tank crews, watching the same film, adjusted their risk calculus. What had been a confidence in a machine became a calculation about exposure and recovery. The myth did not die in a single firefight. It eroded as doctrine and evidence conspired to make the exception ordinary. Strategic ripples appeared within weeks. Commanders at higher echelons rethought deployment density and allocation of reserves. Where previously a defensive line could rely on the deterrent value of heavy armor to blunt an advance, planners now weighed whether concentrating such assets in predictable arcs invited combined arms annihilation. Supply routes were altered to reduce predictable congregation of expensive platforms. Repair trains and recovery units were repositioned nearer, likely kill zones. The side with the industrial depth turned these adjustments into advantage. Tempo, not spectacle, became the deciding metric. Institutionally, the moment led to two enduring changes. Doctrine codified the combined sequence as standard operating behavior. Training mirrored the new priorities. Ordnance prioritized resilience in common failure modes. At the same time, procurement choices reflected a new tolerance for iterative deployment fielding capabilities, quickly accepting imperfections because the industrial pipeline could fix or replace them. That tolerance distinguished an approach that weaponized production as a form of maneuver. The moral of the frontline ledger is simple, and cold rarity sustains myth. Repeatability dissolves it. Once a kill chain shows up on slides and in staff exams, the legend loses leverage. The Panther remained a sound engineering achievement. Its gun and armor were real, but reputation is not pure physics. It is a social instrument, and instruments can be rendered blunt when opponents learn to target the seams in procedure and supply. There are counterfactuals that invite debate. Had heavier guns and improved ammunition arrived earlier, across larger US formations, would the mystique of German heavy armor have collapsed before the Ardennes? If German industry had retained the capacity to replace lost hulls and crews, could doctrine have stayed audacious rather than conservative? These are not questions of deterministic proof, but of margins of production, margin of time, margin of morale. What remains unmistakable is how tactical technique, logistics, and doctrine combined to convert a dramatic kill into a normalized method. The frontline story, one sight, one hit, rapid bracket, became an institutional fact. For a moment, the argument that one tank can lock a street ceased to command behavior. The ledger of supply and the rhythms of procedure took its place. The so-called perfect German medium meets America's ubiquitous Sherman, cheap, numerous, and resilient. We will watch whether concentration or quantity breaks the other's claim to dominance. Which will crack first, the myth of perfection or the weight of numbers?